The headline said it simply, the heart did not. Ozzy Osbourne died on the 22nd of July 2025 at 76 17 days after his last blaze of thunder in Birmingham. The news didn't arrive like a headline. It hit like an aftershock, rolling through dressing rooms and tour buses until it found Alice Cooper, halfway to a stage light he'd spent a lifetime surviving. I went, "That's not right," he admitted later, the armor in his voice briefly cracking. Then he did what lifers do. He turned grief into ritual, lifted his hand, and asked the crowd to say goodnight to a friend who had already slipped beyond the footlights. The roar answered with a single name, Ozzy. 17 days earlier, Villa Park wasn't just a venue, it was a time machine. Back to the beginning, one night only. The impossible reunion, the stubborn miracle. Black Sabbath together again, a throne of blackened steel for a body that had given everything, and a voice that still refused to surrender. 40,000 held their breath. Millions watched the stream. The sky erupted, but Ozzy didn't need a speech. He only needed the look, the tear, the nod. A farewell written in volume, not words. Legends rarely end softly. They choose their exits like they chose their entrances. Loud, defiant, impossible. And when the silence finally came, it wasn't empty. It rang with decades, the bat myths in the family show. The fear, the humor, the survival. The riffs that sounded like sirens for the misunderstood. On that night, and in that news, Alice didn't read a eulogy. He answered a roll call. Two veterans of the same war, one gone to the dark, one left to keep singing into it. Next, we step inside the shockwave. What Alice said, where he said it, and how one shouted goodbye became a torch the whole arena carried into the night. For more than half a century, Alice Cooper and Ozzy Osbourne danced at the edge of chaos. They were not rivals. They were reflections, two sides of the same storm. Both baptized in blood, riffs, and rebellion. Both branded by critics as the wild men of rock. And yet, beneath the theatrics, there was discipline, genius, and survival. Alice with his guillotines and snakes, Ozzy with his bats and black crosses. Each had built a universe where horror met humor, where the grotesque became a kind of salvation. They didn't just perform for fans. They performed for the broken, the outcasts, the ones who didn't fit anywhere else. In the early 1970 seconds, when the world of rock was dominated by flower power and glitter, Black Sabbath and Alice Cooper exploded like twin supernovas from the shadows. Alice brought theater to rock makeup, madness, and showmanship so dark that parents fainted and preachers screamed. Ozzy brought the apocalypse sound so heavy, it seemed to drag the devil himself onto stage. But their rebellion wasn't empty shock. It was revelation. They were giving form to what everyone else was afraid to name. Fear, addiction, isolation, and the quiet rage of being human. Alice once said in an interview, Ozzy and I were the same animal in different cages. And he wasn't wrong. Both were consumed by fame, then spit out by it. Both were resurrected by the women who refused to let them die, Sharon Osbourne and Cheryl Cooper, the unsung saints of rock's madhouse. In those early years, when their eyeliner ran with sweat and liquor, the two bands often crossed paths on stage, in festivals, and in headlines. There was respect, and occasionally, there was fear. Alice once joked, "If I'm the nightmare, Ozzy's the apocalypse." But behind that humor was recognition. Each saw in the other what they saw in themselves, the pain behind the performance. Through the decades, their paths diverged. Alice survived rehab, found faith, and learned to balance the madness with mercy. Ozzy kept dancing with darkness, his battles with addiction, his endless health struggles, his staggering resilience. But the thread never broke. Whenever their worlds collided, a shared stage, an award show, or a backstage encounter, there was a quiet acknowledgement, a knowing nod. In 1991, that nod became music. Hey, Stupid! The anthem of defiance and irony united their voices. Alice's sharp snarl and Ozzy's cracked thunder blending like two prophets screaming into the void. The lyrics, dripping with rebellion and heartbreak, became a generational cry. They weren't mocking stupidity. They were mourning it, the foolishness of pain, of addiction, of human fragility. That collaboration was more than a duet. It was a confession. Years passed. Their hair grayed, their voices deepened, but their souls never quieted. Both men aged like myths, fragile, fierce, untamed. When Ozzy began to fade under the weight of Parkinson's, Alice was one of the few who understood what that meant. To lose the body that carried your sound is to lose your sword, your armor, yourself. Alice had seen it happen to friends before. But this time it was Ozzy the man, who once screamed into eternity and made the world listen. So when the call came that night, when the news of Ozzy's passing broke through the static of the dressing room, Alice froze. It wasn't just the loss of a friend. It was the closing of an era. The last roar of a generation that believed in guitars like gospel and stages like altars. As the lights dimmed and the crowd roared his name, Alice Cooper did not break character. He became it. He turned grief into theater. When he lifted his hand and said, "Everybody, let's say goodnight to Ozzy," the crowd didn't just cheer. They screamed, they cried, they mourned. In that single command, he transformed a concert into a vigil, a requiem in leather and distortion. For the first time in decades, shock rock felt sacred. Next, we descend into the shared past, how two misfits built empires from madness, and how their bond was forged not in friendship but in fire. Before the fame, before the fire, before the makeup and the madness, there were two boys growing up worlds apart, both trying to survive the same kind of silence. One was born Vincent Damon Furnier in Detroit, 1948. The other, John Michael Osbourne, arrived that same year in Birmingham, England. Two continents, same year, same storm. Both came from working-class families. Both learned early that ordinary life had no room for people like them. Alice's father was a preacher. Sundays were sermons and hymnals. Mondays were noise from the factories. Between those two worlds, young Vincent felt a strange pull, a fascination with good and evil, performance and punishment. He loved to scare people even then, to make them laugh and scream at once. His first stage wasn't a concert hall, it was the family living room. He'd act out mock funerals, using toy coffins and his mother's mascara. Somewhere deep down, a character was already forming. The saint and the sinner. The man and the myth who would one day become Alice Cooper. Across the Atlantic, little John Osborne wasn't playing with theatrics. He was fighting just to breathe. His family of 8 lived in a cramped 2-room house, their walls echoing with the clatter of factory shifts and the hiss of hunger. He had dyslexia, panic attacks, and a stutter that made him an easy target for bullies. But when he discovered music first through the haunting wail of the Beatles, something inside him caught fire. He later said, "That sound saved me. I didn't want to be a criminal. I wanted to be a Beatle." For both boys, music wasn't a career. It was oxygen, the only way out. Alice's teenage years were spent sketching monsters and dreaming of Mick Jagger while juggling sermons and curfews. He joined a band called the Earwigs, a joke act that performed Beatles covers at school talent shows, only to find out the crowd loved it. The joke became prophecy. Soon the band renamed itself Alice Cooper, a title chosen precisely because it sounded harmless, almost sweet, like the kind of name that would scandalize parents when paired with fake blood and electric chairs. Ozzy's first gigs weren't in school halls. They were in dive bars, smoky and violent, where a misstep could earn you a broken jaw. He met Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, and together they summoned something new. It wasn't the flower power optimism of the 60 seconds. It was doom, fear, rage, and it felt real. In 1968, Black Sabbath was born, and heavy metal was dragged into existence kicking and screaming. While Alice leaned into theater and irony, Ozzy became pure emotion. Where Alice performed darkness, Ozzy lived it. Both faced early ridicule. Critics called Alice's act disgusting. They called Sabbath satanic. Neither cared. They'd found the pulse of something the world wasn't ready to name, the sound of disillusionment. Alice's shows evolved into elaborate rituals, decapitations, hangings, blood fountains. Ozzy's voice turned every lyric into confession, every scream into prayer. By their mid-20 seconds, both had become icons of the unholy and misunderstood. But fame didn't erase the ghosts. If anything, it fed them. Alice spiraled into alcohol, Ozzy into every drug he could reach. Both would later describe those years as a slow-motion suicide dressed in leather. Their youth was consumed by the very fire they'd lit. Yet both somehow survived barely. What's haunting is how parallel their stories became. Alice once overdosed on whiskey before a show in the early 70 seconds. Ozzy once forgot where he was mid-performance and kept singing to an empty arena after the crowd had been evacuated for a bomb threat. Their lives read like mirrored cautionary tales, each daring the other to keep breathing one more night. And yet, beneath the chaos, there was creation. Alice was inventing shock rock, a genre that would influence everyone from Kiss to Marilyn Manson. Ozzy was refining metal, a sound so massive it would outlive entire decades. They weren't simply musicians, they were myth makers. Two different accents, one unspoken language, defiance. In those fragile early years, before record deals and madness, what tied them together was survival itself. Both sons of laborers, both mocked for their dreams, both determined to scream louder than the noise around them. Alice once reflected, "We were never meant to make it out alive. That's what makes it funny that we did." Ozzy's version was rougher, sadder. "If I hadn't found music, I'd be dead or in prison." It's poetic. Really, two misfit boys born in 1948, both destined to rewrite the sound of rebellion, both destined to fall apart and rebuild, again and again. The preacher's son and the factory worker's son, both born into noise, both born to turn that noise into art. Next, we move into the wild ascent, the early careers that turned them from misfits into monsters, two paths colliding at the heart of rock's most dangerous decade. The 1,970 seconds were not kind, they were electric, dangerous, and unforgiving. For Alice Cooper and Ozzy Osbourne, this was the decade when pain became performance and rebellion became religion. Both men, armed with nothing but instinct and madness, built the kind of careers that looked like suicide notes written in eyeliner and distortion. Alice's rise began in a haze of confusion and outrage. When I'm 18 hit the airwaves in 1971, it didn't just climb the charts, it detonated. Here was a song that captured every confused, angry, half-grown soul trapped between childhood and apocalypse. Parents hated it. Teenagers memorized every word. And suddenly, Alice Cooper wasn't just a band name. It was an idea, a cultural lightning bolt. Concerts became rituals of controlled chaos. Guillotines, gallows, fake blood. Boa constrictors, each night was a grotesque opera about fame, fear, and freedom. But beneath the spectacle, the music throbbed with genuine pain. Alice wasn't mocking horror. He was showing it to a world too polite to admit it existed. He'd once said, "Shock rock isn't about gore, it's about truth. The audience screams because they see themselves." Meanwhile, in the smoke and industrial reign of England, Black Sabbath was unleashing something darker. Their self-titled debut in 1970 changed everything. The opening track began with the sound of thunder and a bell tolling death itself. Then came Ozzy's voice, otherworldly, eerie, full of despair. It was music for a generation tired of pretending things were fine. And though critics dismissed them as noise, fans recognized something holy in the heaviness. Sabbath wasn't entertainment, it was exorcism. The parallels between the two men grew sharper. Alice was painting theater with sound. Ozzy was summoning demons with it. Both built their art on fear and found salvation in it. But while Alice's group thrived on precision and control, Ozzy's life spiraled further out of it. By 1978, Black Sabbath had released 8 albums, redefined rock, and lost its unity to exhaustion and addiction. Ozzy's voice, once a banshee's cry of defiance, grew raw and erratic. He vanished from rehearsals. He slept through interviews. And then, one day, he was gone, fired from his own band. Most thought it was the end. Yet, as always, tragedy for Ozzy became transformation. With Sharon Osbourne, then his manager, later his wife, he clawed back from the abyss. In 1980, he released Blizzard of Oz, an album that proved he wasn't just the face of heavy metal. He was its soul. Crazy Train, Mr. Crowley, Goodbye to Romance. These weren't just hits. They were confessions. A wounded man turning his self-destruction into melody. For Alice, the story was equally violent but quieter. The excess of fame had swallowed him whole. By 1977, he was drinking 2 cases of beer a day and had lost all sense of where the stage ended and life began. His alter ego, the villainous Alice Cooper, had consumed Vincent Furnier, the man. His salvation came not from the industry, but from collapse. A trip to rehab in 1978 nearly killed him, but it also resurrected him. He emerged sober, shaken, and in a way, reborn. From then on, the stage became therapy, not torment. He'd joke years later, "I didn't quit drinking, Alice did." Though they didn't tour together, their lives moved like twin serpents through the same decades, each one reinventing what it meant to survive. The 1,980 seconds turned them both into immortals. Ozzy's solo success roared through arenas. Alice's comeback through albums like Flush the Fashion and Constrictor made him the elder statesman of theatrical rock. Yet the bond between them wasn't found in chart positions. It was found in the quiet understanding that only lifers share the kind of men who keep stepping onto the stage no matter what's broken inside. They crossed paths again during a tour festival in the early 90 seconds. Alice was backstage, sipping soda instead of scotch. Ozzy shuffled in, grinning like a kid who'd cheated death once more. They hugged awkwardly, laughed about who'd outlived whom, and Alice told him, "You're still the Prince of Darkness, brother. I'm just the guy who sells you tickets to the show." That was their friendship in a nutshell. Irony, affection, and shared survival. They didn't need to talk every week. Their bond was carved in scars. The public often saw them as opposites, Alice, the clever provocateur, Ozzy, the unhinged madman, but the truth was simpler. Both were storytellers. Both understood that horror was never about evil. It was about honesty. The world was terrifying, and their music admitted it. By the time the new millennium arrived, both had become elder icons in a genre built on youth and chaos. They laughed at their own survival. They played golf together. They shared family dinners occasionally, Ozzy mumbling jokes only Sharon could decipher, Alice dryly teasing him about his bat snacks. Beneath it all, there was respect. The unspoken acknowledgement. We made it. Barely. But we made it. Two misfit boys born in 1948, now living legends who transformed pain into art and fear into freedom. The irony was cosmic. Two men who built empires out of darkness had somehow become symbols of endurance, humor, and unexpected grace. But fate, as always, wasn't finished. The years ahead would test Ozzy's strength and Alice's heart in ways neither could have imagined. Next comes the height of glory, the peak of fame, the global reign of two monsters turned messiahs, and the unseen cracks that would one day bring it all crashing down. By the dawn of the 1,980 seconds, rock had grown teeth, and those teeth bore the names Alice Cooper and Ozzy Osbourne. What began as rebellion had now become empire. Both men had crossed from scandal to sainthood, from the fringes of music to its thunderous heart. Yet, as their crowns glittered, the shadows grew longer behind them. Alice emerged from rehab with something rare for a rock legend clarity. Gone was the blurred chaos of whiskey-fueled nights. In its place came precision, craft, and an eerie sense of purpose. When Welcome to My Nightmare returned to the charts, it wasn't just a comeback, it was resurrection. His stage shows turned into cinematic nightmares that mixed Broadway with blood. Guillotines fell, monsters rose, and fans screamed not just from fear but from awe. He'd become the ringmaster of controlled insanity, the man who could make horror feel like healing. The character Alice had become immortal, a persona that Vincent Furnier could step in and out of at will. Critics called him the dark Walt Disney of rock, and they weren't wrong. Beneath the snakes and fake blood was storytelling genius. Each show was a morality play for the lost sin, death, resurrection, all choreographed to guitars. When asked what the act meant, Alice once said with a smirk, "It's not about the devil, it's about defeating him." Across the Atlantic, Ozzy was forging his own immortality. In 1980, Blizzard of Oz exploded into the world like a sonic riot. Crazy Train became the anthem of a generation that felt left behind. It wasn't just a song, it was prophecy. The lyrics spoke of madness, fear, and the desperate need to keep moving forward. "I'm going off the rails on a crazy train." Every teenager who'd ever felt broken found a home in that line. Ozzy was chaos incarnate, but he had something his critics never did: heart. Behind every scream, there was sorrow. Behind every outrageous act, there was pain. His stage persona, the Prince of Darkness, wasn't a mask. It was armor. And under it lived a fragile man who never fully believed he deserved the love he received. The 1,980 seconds cemented his reign. Diary of a Madman, Bark at the Moon, The Ultimate Sin, each album was a howl into the abyss. Tragedy followed too. In 1982, guitarist Randy Rhoads, Ozzy's closest musical partner, died in a plane crash mid-tour. Ozzy never recovered from it completely. Alice sent flowers and a handwritten note, "Even monsters mourn." It was a quiet act of understanding between two men who knew how loss could hollow you out. Both found strange salvation in love. Sharon Osbourne became Ozzy's compass, his manager, protector, and eventual wife. She didn't just save his career, she rebuilt it from ashes. Together, they built an empire that mixed chaos with loyalty, scandal with deep, ferocious devotion. Alice, meanwhile, found his anchor in Cheryl Cooper. his longtime love and dancer on stage. When he fell apart, she stayed. When he rose again, she stepped back into the spotlight beside him. Both couples, in their own way, rewrote the mythology of rock marriage, proof that even in the inferno, love can hold its ground. By the late 80s, their fame had transcended music. They were icons, symbols of defiance that refused to age quietly. Alice was touring with younger acts who called him the Godfather. Ozzy was headlining arenas that barely existed when he started. Each had survived the very excess that devoured so many others: Hendrix, Morrison, Moon. They had lived long enough to watch their imitators burn out, and that survival gave their art new gravity. Then came 1991, the moment that turned respect into brotherhood. Alice was recording Hey Stupid, a raw, biting album that blended cynicism with dark humor. He invited Ozzy to lend his voice on the title track. The result was pure alchemy. Two legends roaring together about the absurdity of self-destruction. Ozzy's growl against Alice's snarl. It wasn't harmony, it was revelation. Fans called it a sermon from two high priests of chaos. For once, the monsters were preaching wisdom. The world loved it. The single became an anthem for the burned-out generation of the 90 seconds grunge kids, misfit punks, and old metalheads alike. The music video, now a cult relic, captured the strange poetry of their bond. Fire, smoke, stage lights, two aging rebels still daring the world to look away first. That collaboration became mythic. Behind the scenes, it was simple. Two friends laughing in a studio, trading stories of rehab, religion, and survival. Ozzy joked, "We've both been to hell, good thing the rent's cheap." Alice laughed. "Yeah, but they keep the air conditioning broken." It was gallows humor, but beneath it lay a truth few could articulate. They had both seen death close enough to smell its breath, and instead of surrendering, they turned it into melody. Their peaks weren't built from luxury or luck, but from a relentless refusal to stop screaming. By the time the 2000s arrived, both men had become more than musicians, they were living artifacts of rock's golden age. Ozzy's reality show, The Osbournes, turned his family into pop culture icons, while Alice toured the world as the ageless ghoul who wouldn't die. Their concerts drew not just fans, but pilgrims, people, seeking proof that passion could outlive pain. Yet, even in glory, both knew the price. Ozzy once whispered in an interview, "Every night I walk on stage, I wonder if it'll be the last time." Alice, in his own quiet way, admitted, "I pray before every show, not for success, just for strength." The irony was cruel but poetic. The two men who built careers out of death imagery were now facing their own mortality in real time. But where others saw age, they saw meaning. Alice leaned deeper into theater, using his shows to mock the idea of fame itself. Ozzy, even as illness began to creep in, sang louder, harder, refusing to let the darkness take him quietly. For fans, these years were magic. For the artists, they were countdowns. They had climbed the mountain, looked down on the world that once mocked them, and realized that the real tragedy of success isn't failure, it's surviving long enough to feel the weight of everything you've built. Next comes the turn in the myth, the downfall, the frailty, and the final tragedy, the moment when even legends must face silence. For decades, Ozzy Osbourne and Alice Cooper stood as proof that chaos could be conquered, that even the wildest souls could cheat death by turning it into art. But time, that ruthless editor, eventually comes for every story. And when it came for Ozzy, it came slowly, like a shadow stretching over the stage he loved most. By his mid-70 seconds, Ozzy's body was no longer an instrument, it was a battlefield. Parkinson's disease, spinal injuries, nerve damage, every note, every movement became an act of defiance. But what haunted him most wasn't the pain, it was the silence. The man who once commanded stadiums of 80,000 people now struggled to walk across a room without trembling. Yet, true to form, he fought back not with bitterness, but with one final dream: to sing one last time in Birmingham, the city that made him. And in that dream, standing just off stage, was Alice Cooper. They hadn't toured together in years, but when news broke that Back to the Beginning, Ozzy's final concert, was happening, Alice made sure he was there. He didn't come as a performer, he came as a brother. What he witnessed that night would become legend. Ozzy was rolled onto the stage on a throne of steel, draped in black. The crowd roared as the first notes of "Mama, I'm Coming Home" filled the air. Sharon watched from the wings, tears streaking through her mascara. The sound was imperfect, fragile but real. Alice later said, "That wasn't a concert, that was a resurrection." Then came No More Tears, a song that once felt like rebellion but now sounded like surrender. And finally, Crazy Train, the anthem of survival, of madness, of everything he'd ever been. As fireworks lit up the sky, Ozzy didn't give a speech. He just looked out, nodded once, and whispered something no one could hear. But Alice, standing backstage, knew exactly what it was. It was goodbye. 17 days later, on the 22nd of July, 2025, the world went silent. Ozzy Osbourne rock's indestructible soul was gone. The headline hit the airwaves like thunder. Fans flooded the streets of Birmingham, holding candles and vinyl records. Old punks, young dreamers, tattooed misfits, all united in grief. Alice Cooper was in California, prepping for a show, when his phone rang. Sharon's voice was soft, almost a whisper. "He's gone." Alice froze. He said nothing for a long time. Then he murmured, "That's not right." It wasn't denial, it was disbelief. For men like them, death was supposed to be a metaphor, not a reality. That night, Alice still went on stage. But the show was different. When the last song ended, he didn't exit. He stood beneath the lights, took a long breath, and lifted his hand. "Everybody," he said, his voice cracking, "let's say goodnight to Ozzy." The crowd erupted, not in applause, but in grief. Thousands screamed his name, "Ozzy! Ozzy!" It was spontaneous, primal, and utterly human. A farewell, not rehearsed, not planned, just pure love. Alice didn't speak after that moment. He didn't need to. He simply raised his head toward the ceiling, as if listening for a voice that might still echo through the rafters. Backstage, a crew member handed him a towel. He waved them off. "I'm fine," he said, but his eyes told another story. In interviews that followed, Alice struggled for words. "We weren't close in the Hollywood way," he said, "but every time I saw him, I saw myself. We were the last of our kind." And he was right. They had both survived the drugs, the deaths, the decades, and yet, the hardest thing to survive was each other's absence. Ozzy's funeral in Birmingham was private. Sharon invited Alice quietly. He arrived wearing his signature black coat, his cross pendant gleaming against his chest. There were no theatrics, no makeup, just a man saying goodbye to another who had taught him what it meant to keep screaming, even when the world stops listening. When the service ended, Alice placed a single guitar pick on the coffin. It read, "Still Standing." He didn't speak to reporters. He simply turned and walked away. Weeks later, during his Vegas residency, Alice introduced Poison, his old hit, with an unfamiliar prelude. He told the crowd, "Every time I step on this stage, I hear a friend's voice reminding me, don't stop, ever." The audience erupted, but those close enough saw the tears glinting in his eyes before he turned away from the spotlight. Ozzy's death wasn't just the end of a man, it was the end of an era. He and Alice had carried the banner of fearless authenticity through generations of noise. Now, one voice was gone, and the other was left to echo in its place. The tragedy was not only that Ozzy died, it was that he did so after winning. He'd beaten addiction, rebuilt his family, redefined heavy metal, and left the stage on his own terms. He didn't fade into obscurity, he roared into eternity. And Alice Cooper, his oldest mirror, was left standing in the aftermath, carrying a silence louder than any scream. As Alice told Rolling Stone, "People say rock is dead. They're wrong. It just lost its loudest preacher." And perhaps that's the cruel poetry of it all. Two men who made death part of their art spent their lives outrunning it. But when it finally caught up, it wasn't grotesque or shocking. It was peaceful, human. Ozzy didn't die in a blaze of scandal. He died in love, surrounded by the people who never stopped believing in him. Still, for Alice, every stage now feels haunted. Every encore feels like a seance. He sometimes catches himself looking to the side of the stage, half expecting that familiar grin, the laugh that sounded like gravel and grace. But the space is empty. And so, he plays on. Because that's what lifers do. They don't retire, they don't quit. They keep singing into the darkness, hoping their voice will find the one that left before them. Next, we move to the aftermath. How Alice Cooper carries the torch in the quiet years that follow, and how Ozzy's death reshaped the soul of rock forever. In the quiet that followed Ozzy Osbourne's passing, the world seemed to hum a little softer. The roar of an era was gone, but its echo lingered in playlists, in tattoos, in the trembling hands of fans who grew old with their heroes. And standing at the edge of that silence was Alice Cooper, 77 years old, watching his reflection in the ashes of rock and roll. For Alice, survival had never felt heavier. He had outlived nearly everyone who once shared his stage. Bowie, Lemmy, Eddie Van Halen, now Ozzy. The immortals were leaving, one by one. And yet there he was, still touring, still painting his face in the mirror, still waking up every day to become Alice Cooper. He once said, half joking, "Retirement's a dirty word in my house." But there was no punchline in his tone anymore. Each performance now carried the weight of memory. When he sang "I'm 18, he wasn't celebrating youth. He was remembering it. When the guillotine dropped, it wasn't rebellion anymore. It was ritual, a way to keep the ghosts alive. After Ozzy's death, Alice made one quiet change to his show. At the end of every concert, just before the curtain fell, he'd dim the lights and whisper into the mic, "Good night, Ozzy." It wasn't scripted, it wasn't publicized, but the diehards noticed. Every night, the audience would answer with a cheer that turned into a chant his name, rising once more into the dark. In interviews, Alice grew reflective. He spoke less about the shock and more about the endurance. "When we started, everyone thought we'd burn out in 5 years. We were supposed to be a joke, but here we are, still talking, still playing." That's the punchline. Offstage, his life had slowed to something tender. He lived in Arizona with his wife Cheryl, their home a museum of memories, platinum records, props from old tours, photographs of faces long gone. He rose early, hit the golf course, wrote songs, prayed. The chaos had quieted, but it hadn't disappeared. It had simply matured. And in that stillness, Alice often thought of Ozzy. He'd recall their conversations, half nonsense, half wisdom. Ozzy telling him, "We're not crazy, mate. The world just ain't loud enough." And Alice laughing, "Then we'd better turn it up." Those exchanges had once been comedy. Now, they were scripture. After decades of mock horror, both men had become strangely wholesome figures, the kind of legends who made people smile rather than shudder. Their fans had aged with them. Many brought their children and even grandchildren to Alice's concerts. Whole generations gathered to watch the last survivor of a wild brotherhood who'd once redefined rebellion. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had once been accused of corrupting youth was now thanked by parents for raising them right. Because beneath the theatrics, beneath the serpents and the guillotines, Alice Cooper had always preached one simple message: survive yourself. As for Sharon Osbourne, she continued to manage Ozzy's estate, quietly turning his legacy into preservation rather than spectacle. She and Alice spoke occasionally, trading memories instead of business. Once she told him, "He'd be proud you're still going." Alice smiled. "Tell him to save me a stage up there." And perhaps that's what keeps him moving, the belief that every show, every scream, every encore is one step closer to the final reunion. Because for lifers like him, death isn't an end. It's the next tour. He still ends his nights with prayer, golf in the morning, and guitars in the afternoon. But sometimes, as he walks off stage under the roar of 1,000 fans, he feels something brush his shoulder, a whisper in the dark that sounds suspiciously like laughter. And when that happens, he smiles, because he knows the Prince of Darkness is still keeping time somewhere in the echo. Next, we'll explore what remains: the legacy, the myth, and how two men who made horror beautiful changed music forever. Legends don't die. They dissolve into the bloodstream of culture. And that's exactly where Ozzy Osbourne and Alice Cooper now live, etched into every guitar riff that dares to scream, every lyric that admits the world is broken but worth surviving anyway. Their legacy isn't confined to records. It's spiritual, it's generational, it's myth. For Ozzy, his death became an awakening for the rock community. Tributes poured in from every corner of the world: Metallica, Foo Fighters, Guns N' Roses. Even younger artists from Billie Eilish to Post Malone spoke his name with reverence. The Prince of Darkness had turned out to be a prophet of honesty, a man who'd sung about madness and mortality long before the world had the language for it. His music didn't just influence genres, it invented emotional permission. He made it okay for men to cry, to confess, to fall apart, and still stand before the crowd unashamed. As one critic wrote after his passing, "Ozzy didn't play heavy metal. He was heavy metal." That's the paradox of his legend: a man mocked for chaos who ended up teaching resilience. Alice Cooper's legacy, meanwhile, became the living testament to reinvention. Long before Lady Gaga or Marilyn Manson or Ghost ever turned performance into theater, Alice had written the rule book. The guillotine, the blood, the snakes, they weren't gimmicks. They were metaphors for survival. His shows taught audiences that fear, when faced head-on, can transform into power. Modern artists often credit him without realizing it. Every time a performer breaks the fourth wall, every time pop dares to turn grotesque, Alice's fingerprints are there. And the best part? He's still around to see it, still on tour, still terrifying and charming audiences in equal measure. Their legacies also share something rare in rock mythology: love stories that endured. Ozzy and Sharon, Alice and Cheryl, two marriages that outlasted addiction, fame, illness, and the apocalypse of the spotlight. In a world that glorifies destruction, they built empires on devotion. Sharon called Ozzy her imperfect miracle. Alice called Cheryl his proof of grace. Together, they redefined what forever means in a business built on collapse. But perhaps their greatest legacy lies in how they humanized the monstrous. Both men used masks to tell the truth. Ozzy's darkness was never about evil, it was about honesty. Alice's horror was never cruelty, it was catharsis. They both turned nightmares into empathy. That's why their fans didn't just listen, they worshipped. Because through every scream, every lyric, every drop of fake blood, these men were saying the same thing. You're not alone in your madness. There's beauty in it. Decades from now, when rock historians speak their names, they won't just talk about records sold or awards won. They'll talk about how two boys born in 1948 changed what it meant to be an artist. They'll talk about the night Ozzy turned his final concert into a love letter to the world. And they'll talk about the night Alice Cooper stood beneath blinding lights, lifted a trembling hand, and told thousands to say goodnight to his fallen brother. Ozzy's voice may be gone, but it's still everywhere in commercials, in stadiums, in the hum of an old vinyl spinning in a teenager's bedroom. And Alice's laughter still echoes through every stage door he walks past. Because that's the strange, beautiful truth of legacy. You never really leave when the echo refuses to fade. Now, we reach the reflection, the channel's view, the human behind the myth, the meaning behind the madness, and the quiet question of what remains when the music finally stops. There's something sacred about watching two men outlive their myths. Ozzy Osbourne and Alice Cooper were never supposed to grow old. They were meant to explode on stage, in headlines, in legend. Yet somehow, they endured. And in that endurance lies the truest kind of tragedy. Because living long enough to see your generation vanish one by one isn't victory. It's survival with a cost. When we look at Ozzy, we see more than the wild-eyed frontman who bit the head off a bat. We see a man who never stopped fighting his body, his mind, or his own legend. He was never a villain. He was a mirror. He showed us what it looks like when someone keeps walking through hell and somehow finds laughter on the other side. His final act wasn't chaos, it was grace. A farewell not drowned in scandal, but lit by love, family, and loyalty. Sharon didn't just manage his career, she managed his humanity. And in that last concert, when Ozzy sang Mama, I'm Coming Home, he gave every broken dreamer on earth permission to believe in redemption. Alice Cooper's story, by contrast, is about control. If Ozzy was the storm, Alice learned to surf it. He turned his demons into theater and his failures into philosophy. He never ran from the darkness. He made it part of the act, then walked off stage and prayed for the strength to do it again. The man who once terrified the world now comforts it, proving that even shock can evolve into serenity. The connection between the two men isn't about friendship in the ordinary sense. It's about recognition, that silent nod between survivors who've seen the same abyss and learned to make it sing. Alice didn't need to post a statement or record a tribute. His grief was louder than words. That night, when he raised his hand and said, "Let's say goodnight to Ozzy," the entire world bowed with him. It wasn't just rock history, it was ritual. From this channel's perspective, their stories are the same song played in two octaves. Ozzy screamed the pain. Alice narrated it. Both gave voice to what so many felt but could never articulate, that the line between horror and beauty is thin, and that sometimes salvation sounds like a scream. There's also something profoundly human about their imperfection. They were messy, reckless, often wrong, but never false. And that's why we still talk about them. Because truth, even when ugly, lasts longer than fame. In the end, Ozzy and Alice represent more than music. They represent the endurance of art itself, the idea that sound can outlive flesh, and that even madness can be meaningful. When Ozzy's health failed, fans didn't just lose an icon. They lost a part of their youth, a part of the fire that made them feel indestructible. And when Alice lifted his hand that night, the echo of, "Ozzy, Ozzy," wasn't just for him. It was for all the voices that shaped us and slipped away too soon. And maybe that's what tragedy really is. Not the end, but the echo. Not the silence after the music stops, but the way the memory still vibrates long after. As for Alice, he carries the torch not because he has to, but because he can't imagine dropping it. His survival isn't luck, it's purpose. Every time he paints his face before a show, it's not vanity. It's ritual, a way of saying to his old friend, "I'm still here, still screaming for both of us." And now, as every story must, we come to the silence, the open ending, the nostalgia, the haunting reminder that even legends must one day whisper goodbye. The lights dim, the applause fades, and somewhere in that space between noise and silence, the ghosts begin to sing. Alice Cooper stands alone on stage, the final chords fading into the dark. The guillotine waits in the corner. The props sit lifeless in their crates. But the real illusion has already happened because for 2 hours, he made the dead dance again. He made the world remember. There's something haunting about legacy when you're still living inside it. Alice doesn't chase the past anymore. He curates it. Each concert is a museum of everything he and Ozzy Osbourne once fought for. Defiance, danger, joy, and the strange comfort that comes from staring down death and smiling anyway. Every scream from the audience, every flicker of stage light, carries a whisper of the man who once called himself the Prince of Darkness. Sometimes after the show, Alice lingers by the curtain just for a moment before the crew clears the stage. He listens. The crowd has gone home, the amps are cooling, but in the hum of silence, he swears he still hears it. A voice laughing in the distance, that rough Birmingham rasp calling him brother. Maybe it's memory, maybe it's music, maybe they're the same thing now. Ozzy's final bow was more than an ending. It was proof that even the loudest storms can die quietly, beautifully, and on their own terms. He didn't fade away. He chose his silence. And in doing so, he gave everyone who ever felt lost a final lesson. The darkness doesn't win if you make it sing. As the years press on, Alice carries that song like a relic. He doesn't perform to stay famous. He performs to stay faithful to a time when rebellion was holy and every chord was a prayer. He plays for the kids who still find courage in those old riffs, for the dreamers who believe noise can still change the world, and for the brother who left the mic still warm. Some stories end with applause, others end with echoes. And this one, this long, thunderous, unkillable story ends with both. Two boys born in 1948, both out of step with their time, both too loud, too raw, too real. They rose from poverty and pain to conquer the impossible, to turn madness into melody, and to remind the world that art isn't about perfection. It's about endurance. So when the lights go out and the arena breathes its last sigh, remember what they taught us. Even in the dark, there's always one more song waiting to be sung. Because some legends don't end, they just change keys. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now,